Evio. Before the Vatican was marble and gold, before the church had an army, before the cross became the banner of kings, there was Rome. Not the empire that conquered the world, but the ruin that remained when the world abandoned it. Welcome back to the Ides of April. This is the assassination of Pope John VIII. Episode 1, The Broken Empire. In the closing years of the 9th century, Europe was less a continent than a wound. A jagged, unhealed scar stretching from the icy channels of the North Sea to the dry, burned edges of the Mediterranean. The empire of Charlemagne, once the proud unifier of the Christian world, had begun to fracture, almost from the moment the emperor's body cooled. His descendants, dim men with bright crowns, divided his lands among themselves like children arguing over an inheritance they hadn't earned. From that quarrel, from that quiet greed, the world fell once more into chaos. There were no borders. There were only frontiers. No nations, just allegiances that shifted with the wind. To the north, Viking longships slid like wolves down the rivers of Francia, pillaging monasteries that had stood for centuries as sanctuaries of light. To the south, Saracen raiders from North Africa turned the coasts of Italy into a graveyard of torched abbeys and broken bells. And between those two hungering seas, between the dying west and the encroaching east, stood Rome. Not the Rome of marble triumphs or imperial legions, but a smaller, quieter, humbler thing. A city of ruins and relics, of holy processions winding through streets where the grass grew through the stones. Its population had dwindled, its aqueducts had gone dry, and the Tiber itself carried the sediment of centuries. The dust of empire settling into history. Yet even in its exhaustion, Rome still claimed a purpose grander than survival. It still called itself the heart of Christendom. And the bishop who sat upon the throne of St. Peter still called himself the shepherd of the world. When Pope John VIII ascended to the papacy in the year 872, he found that throne less a seat of authority than a precarious balancing act between collapsing powers. He was an educated man, born of a Roman family of means, schooled in theology and languages, with a temperament that leaned toward diplomacy rather than war. But diplomacy in those years was a fragile weapon. It could be blunted by betrayal, it could be strangled by silence, or simply ignored by men who understood the sword better than the sermon. The Pope's task, as he saw it, was not to build the kingdom of God upon earth. That dream had already died with Charlemagne, but to preserve what little light remained. He wrote letters that stretched across kingdoms, to kings of the Franks, to emperors of Byzantium, to dukes and counts whose loyalty could be rented for the right sum of gold. Each letter was a plea, a reminder that civilization was a delicate thing, easily broken and difficult to restore. But his words were parchment against fire. The Frankish rulers bickered over titles and borders. The Byzantine emperor considered Rome a relic of the past. No one listened to a man whose power existed only in the invisible realm of faith. And so John learned to act as all desperate men do, by compromise. When the Saracen fleets appeared off the Italian coast, burning monasteries and taking priests as slaves, he didn't reach for his army, because he didn't have one, but for his money. He paid the invaders tribute to spare Rome, a transaction that shocked the faithful and just delighted his enemies. The Frankish bishops called it apostasy. The nobles called it cowardice. But for a brief and trembling moment, it worked. The raids ceased. The city could breathe again. Now, the pause didn't last. To men who trade in fear, gold is never enough. The Saracens returned hungrier, demanding more. And John, now poor and embattled, was left to watch as the very act that had saved his people became the proof of his weakness. Even the clergy began to whisper that the papacy had bartered its soul for safety. The Pope, they said, had made peace with the devil. And from that whisper grew a wind, and in that wind the walls of Rome seemed to tremble. John's reign descended into the sort of paranoia that history so often mistakes for madness. He trusted no messenger, no priest, no guard. He saw the invisible hand of his enemies in every silence and in every delay. He sent emissaries to the north pleading for soldiers, to the east for ships, to any power that still even pretended friendship. But none came. When his own courtiers mocked his fear, he quoted scripture to them. "The shepherd is struck and the sheep scatter." They didn't understand that he was speaking about himself. By the late 870s, the papal treasury was basically empty, and the once proud city of God had begun to resemble a besieged fortress. John ordered the fortification of the Leonine walls, the strengthening of the bridges, the stockpiling of grain. He recruited mercenaries, some Christian, but many not, and put them under the papal banner. It was said that for the first time, the soldiers of St. Peter fought not for faith, but for coin. And that symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. And still, he refused to surrender. In a letter to the clergy of Gaul, written in his own hand and preserved only in fragments, John lamented that, quote, "the body of Christendom is sick and its heart beats in Rome alone." Now that's one of the few lines of genuine poetry to survive from his papacy, and perhaps the truest description of the time. And the disease wasn't paganism or even war. It was apathy. The empire had forgotten how to believe. And in that vacuum, Rome itself began to turn inward. The noble families, that old Roman aristocracy, saw opportunity in papal weakness. They began to whisper of reclaiming the city from the priesthood, of turning the papal throne into a civic office. John's reforms, his taxes, his conscriptions only hardened their resolve. Each decree he signed gained him enemies faster than allies. The Lateran palace, once the home of councils and choirs, became a bunker of locked doors and armed guards. So the chronicles of the time are vague about his appearance in those final years, but you can imagine the picture. An aging man in fading robes, pacing candlelit halls, writing letter after letter to men who would never answer. He could hear the city breathing beyond the palace walls, the merchants, the soldiers, the street preachers crying of the end times. And he must have wondered whether God still listened to Rome at all. And it's here, in this dimly lit corridor of history, that the story of John VIII begins not as a tragedy, but as an inevitability. For when faith collides with fear, when power is left without protection, and when holiness becomes indistinguishable from politics, the result is always the same. The Pope wouldn't be overthrown by pagans or murdered by kings. He would be killed by his own, by the people who once kissed his ring and called him father. But that's a story for a later episode. For now, in the waning light of the 9th century, as the bells of St. Peter's echo faintly across a dying empire, the world still believes that the throne of God's vicar is untouchable. And Pope John VIII, fragile, hopeful, already half forgotten, he believes it too. Episode 2, The Pope and the Pirates. If the 9th century was a wound, then Italy was where the infection had set in deepest. The coasts had become porous. The sea no longer belonged to Christians. From the deserts of North Africa and the islands of the Levant came swift black ships with carved prows and crews who fought like men possessed. They sailed not under a flag, but under a prophet. They called themselves merchants, though they sold nothing but fear. The Italians, out of habit, called them Saracens. the old Roman word for any enemy from the sunburned edges of the world. You know what they were talking about. They weren't armies in the old sense. They were more like storms. They were sudden, ungovernable, and gone before anyone could answer. A monastery might be standing at dusk and ash by dawn. Whole villages along the Tyrrhenian coast vanished overnight, the smoke still rising when the word reached Rome. In those years, the Mediterranean was less a sea than an open grave. For Pope John VIII, the Saracens represented a paradox too bitter for theology. Men who didn't believe in the Christ who hung on the cross, yet seemed to possess all the earthly power that his followers had lost. The papacy could thunder its anathemas from the marble halls of the Lateran, but no curse could sink a fleet. Faith couldn't outswim an oar. And so John, ever the realist, resorted to the only language that pirates understand. Yep, he paid them. The gold of St. Peter, or what remained of it, was carried south under guard, cart after cart of coins disappearing into the salty wind. To his mind, this wasn't betrayal. This was about preservation. Better to ransom Rome than to bury her. But to others, the act was unforgivable. His advisors begged him to reconsider, and when he wouldn't, they began to whisper of a pope gone soft, a man who had made peace with the infidel. In those letters sent north to Frankish bishops, John explained himself with the exhaustion of a man who knows the argument can't be won. A man may pay tribute, he wrote, to spare the blood of Christians, as he would pay a surgeon to save a limb. But the metaphor didn't persuade anybody. To the rules of Francia, the papacy had become not a moral compass, but a debtor's ledger. Their emissaries began to arrive in Rome with the thin smiles of men who smell weakness. But still, for a time, as noted, the payments worked. The raiders pulled back from the Italian coast. Pilgrims began to return to Rome. The trade roads reopened. For the first time in years, the bells of St. Peter were rung for something other than alarm. And in that fragile calm, John allowed himself to dream of a new Christian order. One bound not by empire, but by shared survival. It was a beautiful dream. And like most dreams born of desperation, it wouldn't last. The Franks refused to see the peace as victory. To them, John's negotiation was not salvation, but surrender. Their bishops began to speak of a new pope, one who might restore the dignity of Rome through blood rather than coin. Envoys were sent to the imperial court of the East, urging the Byzantine emperor to intervene, to install a stronger man upon the throne of St. Peter. The papacy had been insulted by pagans before, but never by its own children. That betrayal would mark John forever. In the spring of 875, when the payments to the Saracens were due once more, the treasury was empty. The raiders returned, first in scattered bands, then in fleets. They swept inland from the coast, burning the vineyards outside Naples, pillaging Capua, even daring to approach the walls of Rome itself. For 3 nights, the fires along the Tiber glowed so bright that fishermen on the opposite shore swore they could read by the light of them. Inside the Lateran, John assembled his council. The surviving minutes of that meeting read like the transcript of men arguing with the sea. One advisor begged him to flee to the north, another to surrender, and a third to send a messenger to the Saracen camp offering yet another payment. John dismissed them all. The shepherd cannot abandon the fold, he said, nor can he bargain with wolves a second time. It was at that moment, say the chroniclers, that he began to speak of building an army, not of knights or crusaders, but of Romans. He conscripted the city's tradesmen, the guilds, even the clergy. It was a pitiful force, shoemakers, bakers, and scholars with borrowed swords, but it was his. From the steps of St. Peter's, the Pope who had once sent gold to buy peace now blessed the weapons of war. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, but something remarkable happened. The Saracens, perhaps sensing the strange unity that had seized the city, withdrew before this new army could strike. They moved south toward easier prey. John had, by faith or fortune, survived his own contradiction. But survival is always a temporary thing, and peace never came back to him in the same shape. In its place arrived doubt. The Frankish kings mocked his holy militia, calling it the army of beggars. The Byzantine emperor, to whom John had written for aid, responded with polite silence. Even within Rome, the nobility muttered that a man of God had turned soldier. What John saw as necessity, others saw as blasphemy. In one surviving letter to the Archbishop of Ravenna, written in his own neat hand, John confesses that he feels, quote, "The Lord had placed me between two darknesses, one of faith and one of fear, and I no longer know which is the greater sin." Now that could be the truest portrait of him that we possess, a man caught between the vision of what the church should be and the terror of what it had already become. By 877, the year that broke him, John found himself entirely alone. The Saracens were resurgent, the coffers were bare, and his allies were laughing behind closed doors. It was then that he made his last and most desperate gamble. In a ceremony heavy with pomp and dread, John crowned Charles the Bald, King of the Franks, as Holy Roman Emperor, the only living heir to Charlemagne's mantle. It was an act both symbolic and pleading. In return for the crown, John expected protection, he expected soldiers, and a wall of steel between Rome and the ruin. Charles accepted the crown. He even swore the oaths. Then he left Italy, never to return. Within months he was dead, some say poisoned. His empire, such as it was, fell again to squabbling heirs. John was left staring at a vacant throne, his hopes collapsing once more into dust. He would write one final time to the princes of Christendom, quote, "I have crowned an emperor, and now there is none. I have bargained for peace and found war. I have guarded faith and been betrayed by the faithful." There's no bitterness in that line. There's only palpable exhaustion, the weariness of a man trying to hold back a tide that had already claimed the shore. In the years to come, the pirates would return, the nobles would conspire, and the world would forget how near Rome had come to annihilation. But John would remember. He would remember the sea, the smoke, the sound of oars cutting the Tiber. And in those sounds, he would begin to hear something else. The slow, steady rhythm of his own approaching death.
If your dog could talk, they'd beg for Ollie. The full-body tail wag, the excited little hops, the big, goofy grin, that's the Ollie effect. Ollie delivers clean, fresh nutrition in 5 drool-worthy flavors, even for the pickiest eaters. Made in U.S. kitchens with highest quality human-grade ingredients, Ollie's food contains no fillers, no preservatives, just real food. And here's the thing. Healthier food means a happier pup, more energy, shinier coats, and more excitement at mealtime. With 5 protein-packed recipes like fresh beef with sweet potatoes or fresh turkey with blueberries, even the pickiest eaters can't resist. You might think my dog eats better than I do, and that's probably true when it comes to Ollie. Get your welcome kit. For any first-timers, Ollie will send out your pup's first box with 2 weeks' worth of meals, a free storage container for mess-free serving, and a guide of how to gradually switch them over to their new diet. Dogs deserve the best, and that means fresh, healthy food. Head to ollie.com/IDES. Tell them all about your dog and use code IDES to get 60% off your welcome kit when you subscribe today. Plus, they offer a happiness guarantee on the first box, so if you're not completely satisfied, you'll get your money back. That's OLLIE.com/IDES and enter IDES to get 60% off your first box. Quick question. Could you list every financial account you have right now? Your 401k, checking, savings, investments, maybe even that old retirement account from a job 10 years ago? Most people can't. And that lack of awareness usually means money is being left on the table. That's where Monarch Money comes in. It's an all-in-one personal finance tool that organizes your entire financial life in one clean dashboard on your phone or laptop. In minutes, you can link all your accounts, see where your money is going, and get smart visuals that make the big picture clear. No more juggling apps, no more spreadsheets. Monarch is designed for people with busy lives. It helps you save more, invest smarter, and actually feel in control of your money. That's why it's been named Best Budgeting App of 2025 by the Wall Street Journal, Forbes' Best App for Couples, and even recognized by CNBC as one of the top fintech companies in the world. So stop guessing, stop leaving money on the table, and start feeling confident about your finances. Don't let financial opportunity slip through the cracks. Use code IDES at monarchmoney.com in your browser for half off your first year. That's 50% off your first year at monarchmoney.com with code IDES.
Episode 3, The Emperor's Shadow. History has never lacked for men who called themselves emperor. What it does lack, then as now, are the few who understood what the word means. By the year 875, the dream of Charlemagne's empire had collapsed into a bickering chorus of princes and pretenders. The West Franks quarreled with the East, the Lombards snarled at both, and the once glorious coronation crown, the Iron Crown of Lombardy, forged, it was said, with a nail from the crucifixion, had become a traveling prize, traded from one opportunist to another like a relic in a marketplace. Amid this confusion, Pope John VIII tried to resurrect the illusion of unity. He believed, or maybe only hoped, that if he could anoint another emperor, the ghost of Charlemagne might rise again and impose order on a world fraying at the edges. The candidate he chose, as discussed earlier, was Charles the Bald, a grandson of that great emperor, a man clever enough to survive court intrigue, yet too indecisive to command loyalty. John crowned him in St. Peter's Basilica in December of that year. The ritual was lavish, though the empire it celebrated was largely imaginary. Incense hung in the air like a fog. Torches burned in rows along the marble aisles. The choir sang as if Rome itself were listening. And when John placed the crown upon Charles's head, he whispered the ancient words, "Receive the sign of glory." If only glory could be given like a crown, right? Within months, Charles was dead, poisoned by his own nobles, allegedly. Others claimed it was divine retribution for his vanity. To John, the cause mattered less than the consequence. The man he had crowned the protector of Christendom had become just its latest corpse. The imperial throne was empty again, and this time there would be no one willing to sit upon it. What followed was a kind of unraveling. Without an emperor, the fragile peace between church and crown dissolved. Local warlords began to style themselves princes of the Romans. Dukes took possession of monasteries and abbeys, turning them into fortresses. Bishops purchased titles like property deeds. The lines between priest and politician, between saint and soldier, blurred beyond recognition. John continued to write letters, always letters with this guy, pleading for stability, for faith, for reason. He wrote to Louis the German, who responded with contempt. He wrote to Byzantium, that glittering twin of Rome, asking for ships to defend the Italian coast, but none came. The Eastern Emperor regarded the papacy as just an exhausted relic, useful only when convenient. In one surviving letter, John admits, quote, "I find myself surrounded by men who speak of God as a banker speaks of coin, only in terms of what he owes them." Now that's a heartbreaking line, not because of its cynicism, but because of its clarity. He knew precisely the sort of world he ruled, and still he refused to despair. But despair, like empire, has a way of creeping in through the cracks. In 879, the Saracens, emboldened, organized, and richer than ever, returned to Italian waters. Their raids reached the walls of the Leonine city, the fortified quarter surrounding St. Peter's itself. Rome trembled. The citizens fled inland. The pontiff, hemmed in by enemies both foreign and domestic, sent desperate appeals for aid to every Christian monarch still alive. No one answered. Those who might have helped simply saw no profit in it, and so John, unwilling to flee and unable to fight, did the only thing he could. He endured. Now, in that endurance, there was a peculiar kind of heroism. Not the heroism of victory, but the slower, more private heroism of persistence. The sort of faith that survives even after it stops expecting some reward. That's right. He reorganized the papal militia. He repaired the walls. He appointed loyal bishops in provinces that barely acknowledged his rule. And to many in Europe, it looked like flailing. To John, it was duty. The fisherman, he reminded his priests, must keep rowing even when the sea is lost. But it's difficult to steer when the current itself has turned against you. Inside Rome, factions multiplied. The great Roman families, the Crescenses, the Theophylax, the Spoletans, began to view the papacy as a prize worth seizing. John's own advisors, weary of his austerity, whispered that, maybe a younger, more malleable pope could restore the city's fortunes. Maybe. Some even plotted to elect one while he was still alive. Look, the old man saw it coming. He could feel the betrayal in the air, as tangible as the incense he burned each morning. He tightened his circle of guards. He dismissed his steward. He ceased receiving guests after sunset. Even in the daylight, he carried himself with the posture of a hunted man. The same clerics who once mocked his paranoia began to share it. The papal palace, once filled with the sound of hymns and debate, now echoed with the footfalls of armed sentries. And yet, the strangest thing of all is how calm his writings remained. The letters from this period, those that survive anyway, are not the ravings of a concerned despot, but the reflections of a weary philosopher. "We were promised," he wrote, "that the gates of hell would not prevail against the church, but no one said that they wouldn't knock." So when the Saracens struck again that autumn, he personally led the defenses of the city, standing on the battlements in white robes as arrows hissed through the dusk. The chronicles claim he prayed aloud as the sky darkened, "Lord, if my blood be the ransom of Rome, let it be enough." Now, it's difficult to say whether this happened or whether the story was embroidered later by the faithful, but the image endures. An old pope staring into the smoke, one hand raised not in blessing but in defiance. What no legend can redeem, however, is what came next. In the following months, the city didn't fall to the Saracens. It fell to itself. Rome's own nobility seized power in the countryside, strangled papal revenues, and raised private militias loyal only to their names. John VIII, the last man to call himself both priest and emperor's equal, found himself little more than a hostage in his own capital. The letters stopped, finally. The light in the Lateran windows went dark. The age of kings had given way to the age of assassins. What began as the dream of empire had become a ghost story, whispered among ruins. And somewhere in those ruins, surrounded by men who no longer believed in the sanctity of anything, Pope John VIII waited for the inevitable. The hammer had not yet fallen, but its echo was already in the air.